Hello, art history students. We are studying Greek and Roman art. As you know, the Greeks and the Romans lived in a classical age, which means that later civilizations copied Greek and Roman art and literature and architecture and government and philosophy, including we today also copy those things. So the Greeks and the Romans did art that was realistic, meaning it imitated life. It looked real in a way that the Egyptians never did. But their art was also idealized or beautiful, meaning they wanted their art to look like life but better, which is kind of what we still copy today often when we do artwork. Now, few paintings survive from the Greek and Roman times, but lots of sculptures do. So we're going to take a look at a few examples of classical sculptures from the time of the Greeks and the Romans. This is called the Spear Bearer. It was sculpted in around 450 BC, and it's super realistic, as you can see, but it is also idealistic. The proportions are perfect. It is a sculpture of harmony and grace. This is a portrait of Alexander the Great, probably sculpted at around 330 BC. The likeness is very realistic. It looks like an individual person, in other words, probably what Alexander actually looked like. This sculpture is called the Dying Trumpeter. It was sculpted around 230 BC. It is of a dying Gaul man. You can see that this man is French or Gaul because of his mustache and the torque around his neck. The impressive thing to me about this sculpture is that it shows movement. I mean, he's sitting there dying, but it looks like an actual, he's not just standing there for his portrait, it looks like a story being told. This sculpture is of Augustus Caesar, sculpted in AD 20. The sculpture or the statue belonged to Caesar's wife. It depicted him as young and strong, even though he was old by AD 20. The sculpture was inspired by the spear bearer. As a viewer, we're supposed to remember that earlier Greek sculpture when we look at this one of Augustus. The Cupid and the dolphin at his feet are symbols that he is divine or descended from the gods, and the pictures on his breastplate tell the story of one of his victories. So your assignment is to draw a Greek or a Roman statue. You can draw one of the ones that I sent home with you in your packet, or you can find a statue on your own from the internet. Whatever you want is fine with me. The thing that I care most about is that you try hard shading the statue, meaning make it look realistic or 3D using light and dark with your pencil. So here are the steps in how to complete your assignment. First, you need to transfer the image. You can draw it freehand, meaning you can print out the picture or look at a picture online and just draw it as best you can on a new piece of paper. You could transfer the image with a grid. To do this, you draw a grid using a ruler on one copy of the image, and then draw the same grid on your paper really lightly. You'll erase it later. Then you can draw square by square on the paper, looking at a square on the original image and transferring just that square to your new piece of paper. Another way to do it, the way that I prefer actually, is you could make a carbon copy. To do that, turn one copy of your image over and cover the reverse side with graphite from your pencil or with charcoal if you have it. I'm using charcoal here. Cover the whole area because you'll be tracing it later through the paper. Then place the image directly over your new paper with the pencil side down or the charcoal side down. Then simply trace the lines of the main forms in the image, or you can just trace it. You can tape it up on a window or something and trace it as best you can. Now, it's not actually as difficult as it seems to shade. Basically, there's just a few steps that you'll use no matter what you're drawing. Step one is to use light pencil to put in some of the midtones. Step two is to put some darker pencil on top of the light, blending it together. Step three is to blend with something like a tortillon or a finger or a rag to gray everything out and smooth everything over. Step 4 is to add the darkest darks on top of that smooth gray. And step 5 is to add highlights, which you can do with an eraser. So let's use those steps as I go through this example. Looking at the original picture, try to observe the way the light falls on the form in your photograph, and you'll want to shade your drawing to match the way the light looks in the original image or photo. Remember that no matter how complicated the task seems, it's really just about breaking it down into simple shapes and shading them one step at a time. So we start first by shading lightly with a pencil. I'm using a harder pencil here, a 2H pencil, because it shades pretty lightly. And I'm blocking in the midtones of the dark sides of the forms. As I'm doing this, I'm trying to reduce the drawing to just a couple of values. I'm doing a dark side midtone over most of the shadow area from the image, and I'm also at this point adding a little darker shading for the core shadow areas. I'm using my pencil softly, gradually blending from dark to light. Once that step is over, it should look fairly complete, but it's not as complete as it's going to be. The next step is to take a tortillon, a blending stick, or a paper towel, a finger, a rag, whatever, and smooth out the drawing. This will darken it up a bit, and that's okay. The next step, when you're done with blending the whole thing, you'll see that it all looks a little bit too gray, too in the middle of the tone. To make your drawing pop, the darks will need to be darker and the lights will need to be lighter. So go over it again with a dark pencil. I'm using a 4B, I think, here, shading layer after layer to make the dark areas even darker, but still smoothly blending them towards the light. Finally, the last step is with your eraser, bring the light areas back. You can add highlights. You can keep going back and forth, blending, adding darks, adding lights until it looks just how you want it. Now, as I work on other parts of the drawing besides just the chest area, just piece by piece, let me just talk about this sculpture that I've chosen to copy for a minute. It's actually a small part of a larger one. It's called Laocoon and His Sons. And no one knows exactly when the original sculpture was made. Sometime between 200 BC is probably the earliest date for it, and AD 70 is probably the latest. It was buried after it was made and found in pieces in somebody's vineyard in Rome in 1506. That sounds like a long time ago now, but the original statue was 1,500 years old by the time it was refound. And so some sculptors from the time, from 1506, put it back together like a puzzle. Note that it is missing some pieces, some hands and some arms are gone, but mostly we have the original statue as it existed 2,000 years ago. The story that the statue depicts goes like this. During the Trojan War, the Greek army was trying to conquer the city of Troy, but couldn't get past its walls. You might remember that they made a gigantic horse and hid a bunch of soldiers inside of it, right outside the city gate. So when the Trojan soldiers woke up the next morning and looked out on the battlefield over their walls, they thought something like, well, isn't that nice of those guys? They gave up and they left us a parting gift, a gift horse, if you will. Meanwhile, the Greek soldiers were hiding inside the horse, of course. Now, Laocoon was a Trojan priest of Poseidon, and he thought something was fishy. He warned the rest of the Trojans not to bring the horse into the city walls, but they didn't listen to him. And the gods, who evidently in this story favored the Greeks, sent sea serpents to strangle him and kill him and his sons to prevent him from talking. Once that was done, the Trojans brought the horse inside, locked the gates, and went to sleep, and it did not end well for them. As you can see from the statue, it didn't end well for Laocoon and his sons either. Their limbs are twisted in pain, their faces are expressive with agony. The statue is beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Speaking of terrifying, you might be thinking, well, Mr. Williams drew that statue. I could never do a drawing like that, but you can. It's actually not as hard as it looks. Just follow the steps I've outlined. Try as hard as you can, step by step. You've got 2 weeks to get it done, and in the end, I'll bet you like what it looks like. I know I will. Good luck.